Tim. Welcome to the podcast. I'm super excited to have you here today, man. And huge shout out to our boy Aaron up there at Pitt for helping get us connected that way, man. For people who aren't familiar with you and all the incredible work and research you've done in the space of human performance that way, would you mind filling in a little bit about who you are and all the incredible stuff you've got going on up there at Pitt now?
Yeah, sure. Thanks again for having me on. It's great to actually make the connection and everything. I am a associate professor here at the University of Pittsburgh and the director of the Sports Science Master's program. And prior to coming here, um, doing a lot of human performance research and athlete research. So my main focus is strength and power development, which I know we're going to get into a little bit today, but also on athlete monitoring and monitoring those force production characteristics.
And you mentioned the big word there, strength, and you mentioned force production and as well. And I think the two go hand in hand to a certain extent. And I'm really excited to dive into kind of the mechanisms of strength with you today, Tim, because I think a lot of times people know that they want strength, right? Every meathead at one point wanted a bigger bench press, right? I was certainly that guy back in high school, but the whole concept of how do we go about achieving that, unfortunately, I don't think we can just one rep max every single day until we beat our previous one. I mean, you could
You can
try it,
try.
but it probably won't go well, right? There has to be more of a method to the madness, if you will, in developing strength. And I think just from starting off that way, you mentioned about force and strength, and I think people forget that strength is all about the ability to generate maximal force and move it through a full range of motion. It's not so much as like, oh, well, we just have peak isometric force at this angle and we can't actually do anything with it. Like, I feel like for me, when I think about the definition of strength, it has to translate to doing something and not just not moving. I think some of the developments around isometric force production are a whole different conversation from peak maximal strength, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, you hit on a lot of things there. I'd probably amend your definition only slightly. So I went to school and studied under Dr. Mike Stone, who I believe at one point was given the nickname the Sultan of Strength. But one of the things that was really emphasized to us there, and I've kind of taken that and ran with it, is strength is an ability. It's an ability to produce force, and it's an ability because it is a trainable characteristic. So we can modify how someone or an athlete produces force. And that could be via a lot of different training methods, mechanisms, loading, etc. But the take home message is that it's an ability to produce force. Now, what's really important with that is we produce force in specific contexts. So, not all athletes are producing force the exact same way. So, this is why I'd say I amend the definition a little bit. It's not always about maximal force. Maximal force is certainly important, but given the task that we're performing, we may not always need maximal force. In fact, it might actually be inefficient to do so. I'll take a distance runner, for example. A distance runner has to produce, we'll talk about a marathon runner, the number of strides and steps that they have to take over the course of the entire race. If they were to produce maximal force within every single stride, they'd be worn out by the time they get to 100 meters. But at the exact same time, it is all about producing the necessary amount of force to continue to hit their pace, hit their stride, for lack of a better term. I know that was a pun without it trying to be a pun, but trying to maintain their force production over long periods of time. So that is a characteristic of force, where we are producing submaximal forces that will allow us to sustain the activity while also accomplishing the necessary task. Now the other thing is that we may have to produce force against various external resistances. So that could be ourself. We're battling gravity. Every time you're in the weight room, you're in a constant ongoing battle with gravity. But at the same exact time, we may have to produce force against somebody else, an opponent, for example. In the racing industry, we obviously have to deal with G forces and being able to counteract what's happening in one direction or another direction. But at the same exact time, we may have to impart force onto an implement. So if we're trying to kick a soccer ball, throw a baseball or softball, use a stick in lacrosse, that we have to first impart the forces into the ground through our body and ultimately through our limbs to be able to accelerate them effectively. So again, it is against an external resistance, and that external resistance can vary. But on top of that, we are also doing this within a task specific context, because if I talk about a soccer player, um, they may have to sprint, they may have to change direction, they may have to jump, they may have to produce force against somebody else to contain the ball. All of these tasks are very unique in terms of the amount of force and the rate at which they have to produce that force and the time over which they have to apply that force. All of those vary. But also, like, shooting a soccer ball is not one task and it's the same way every single time. If you don't believe me, the World Cup's on right now, and you can watch every single way how to kick a soccer ball. But with all the different types of shots that they have, it's very unique. So, if I was to give you a true definition of what strength is the ability to produce force against an external resistance within a task specific context. So, that means that we have both a force and a time component to everything. And ultimately, what this comes down to is how we apply force over that given period of time, with the task constraints that we end up having. So I know that we could just talk about this for days and days and days, but ultimately it comes down to the impulses that we create and kind of the, for lack of a better term, the shape of those impulses, whether they're peaked or more flat.
I love the way you broke that down, Tim. And to kind of run it back and hit some of those highlights, you broke down extensively the task specific component. And that's something that I really want to hone in on that way, because I think a lot of times people forget that basic principle in like exercise science 101, specific adaptation to impose demand, right? Like, obviously, the main thing needs to be the main thing. And if we're working with a field sport athlete. You mentioned soccer, lacrosse, any of those type things. That way, we have to, if we're looking to enhance performance, we have to do things that carry over to on field, on pitch, right? I think everyone's familiar with that basic sport specific concept that way. But as you mentioned, there's so much variability in movement. I've been kind of going off the deep end over the past 6 months around ecological dynamics, right? We have multi and meta stability that says athletes are able to switch between movement patterns pending whatever environmental constraints are thrown at them. And we can go off the deep end on the different environmental constraints that exist in sport, but ultimately that variability of movement is highly functional and necessary to produce elite performance. But that variability needs to allow the athlete to still produce enough strength, sufficient strength levels to achieve the task at hand, right? So going back to our lacrosse example, if I've got a male lacrosse athlete who's going to shoot a shot into the upper right corner of the goal and it's going to be going 105 miles an hour, based on whatever position they find themselves in, are they able to produce the necessary force in the time that they are allotted to make that shot? And I think that's where this whole concept of strength is super fascinating to me, because it's not as simple as just beefing up your bench press like I used to think it was back in high school. There's so much more to it than that. And as a result, the training becomes, in my opinion, a little complex. On one hand, I love the concept of Occam's razor and simplify things as much as we can, especially in training. However, at the same time, we are trying to solve complex problems here.
Mhm.
Sports are inherently complex. We can only simplify developing strength with specific sport adaptation to a certain level, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, the most specific thing to the sport task itself is the sport task.
Right, right.
But at the same exact time, we're not necessarily training the sport in the weight room. What we are doing is we're training movements that occur in the sport. Because now the key thing is, you could make this argument from the motor learning standpoint, the motor learning world, is that we need to be, as coaches, introducing task constraints that allow the individual to have that variability, as you were talking about, to be able to essentially search for the best case scenario to solve the problem in front of them. So, as coaches, introducing unique task constraints to the individual to provide the variability allows the individual to learn better. There's a lot of different theories about the best way to do this, but dynamical systems theory is certainly one aspect of it, and actually using resistance training within that model is actually pretty unique. Um, I think about it from uh, again, the motor learning standpoint, but also the progression standpoint of where the individual is. You mentioned that there's a lot of different ways to train these individuals. I can't remember where I heard it from, but it's a common phrase in our field is that everything works until it doesn't. So, but again, if you think about how we would progress someone in like a squat exercise, what's the first thing you do? Body weight squat. Like can you move efficiently um, or through this basic movement pattern? Okay. Now let's introduce a new task constraint. I'm going to have you hold a dumbbell in front of you in a goblet squat. How do you adapt to that scenario? And how well do you continue to move with that? And here's the thing, a lot of the athletes who have never touched a weight before, younger athletes, less experienced athletes who've never done that before, that is a hard challenge for some of them just to figure out how to move through that pattern without getting too forward on their toes or anything like that. What happens with their movement pattern if we introduce heel wedges or weightlifting shoes that have an elevated heel? It changes the movement pattern. Things like that. And then, if we add a barbell dynamic versus a front squat, a back squat, an overhead squat, all of those different things have different task demands. So again, being able to introduce the variability, but the key, not introducing too much variability too early so that they can't actually learn the task itself. Some of the advanced training methods that we have out there, like variable resistance training with chains and bands, or accentuated eccentric loading with weight releasers. I tell my students this all the time. Look, those are sexy training methods. They're flashy and everything, but the reality is not every athlete needs that. Can they do it? Sure. Do they need to do it? No. You will have some athletes that will never touch those methods, and that's fine as long as they're getting the training adaptations that they need. So, again, this all goes back to the basics in terms of a needs analysis. What are the tasks that the athlete has to perform within their sport? Identify within that what type of force production characteristics do they need to be successful? And, you could have a blanket statement and say all, but at the same exact time, like if I'm sprinting, I need to produce force a certain way. That's case in point. But then you have to think about everything that goes into that, the body positioning. How much force am I producing during an acceleration phase versus a transition versus a max velocity phase? Because there's going to be, for lack of a better term, a weakness somewhere within that is preventing the individual from being better at that task. And ultimately, our business is allowing the individual to apply and produce their force more efficiently.
And to your point, this makes strength a concept of both biomechanical and neurophysiological constructs, right? To one end of the equation, there is a lot of emphasis on positioning, a lot of emphasis on forces. And obviously, if we go back to the original research, bigger muscles tend to produce more force, right? Size principle. So there is certainly a mechanical element, but as you were talking as well, there's also that neurophysiological construct, right? Even from like more of an underlying physiology standpoint, what's our capillary density? What's our ability to actually shuttle nutrients in and take nutrients, waste products away from working muscles? Even just getting into specific cellular like signaling pathways. If we go back to the XFIZ 200 lectures on like mTOR activation, and different protein synthesis type things that way, right? Getting into all of that sort of thing. I think just pulling your line again, it's not that there's any one training style that's inherently bad, but it might not work forever because ultimately, in order to develop strength in a specific context, you need to be driving either mechanical, neurophysiological, or ideally both adaptations simultaneously to push that person closer to that end goal.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, the goals of each individual are going to be very unique, which is why I do think oftentimes, and I'm guilty of it too, it's a lot easier to write a very general training program for all of your athletes versus making it very specific for each individual athlete. I often joke, not joke, but I mean, I talk to my students about the fact that 80 to 90% of your training programs, and it could even be between sports, are almost identical. But then the 10 to 20% that's left over is where you can make things really unique. Again, this comes down to, at that point, exercise choice. If I were to give you a volleyball player and a baseball player, what you're going to find is a lot of the movements that they have to perform are very similar, which means, there's a rotation component, there's a jumping component, there's a diving component, there's a running component. So all of these different pieces are maybe, visually unique to the sports in terms of like the distances and everything they have to cover. But the reality is these individuals you could train very similarly. And again, where you start to add in that 10 to 20% to make it a little bit more unique, develop the foundation that you need, which generally speaking, is going to be um, your force production characteristics or your maximal strength, and then you build on it from there. So once you have that foundation, now we can start to really sprinkle in those things to make it unique.
So it sounds like mechanistically, as long as you lay that foundation of ability to produce force in specific positions through specific ranges, again, depending on the context, you're going to lay the essential foundation, I guess I'm trying to say, for all the other flashy, shiny, sexy training stuff you want to get into later on.
Yeah, yeah, and again, I don't want people to take away from this podcast and say, "Well, Tim says you only have to be, you have to be X amount strong to be able to do certain things." There is research to support it, but the difference between squatting double body weight versus 1.9 is really not that different. But at the same exact time, what does the athlete need and when? Is really what it comes down to. I will never tell anyone not to use like a potentiation complex, for example, if they're squatting, 1.7 times, 1.75 times their body weight versus someone else who squats double. I think what we get stuck into is, and I present on this periodically, is we get stuck into a world of fives and zeros. So it is, I'm squatting 100 kilos. Well, no one cares if you squat 101. They care if you squat at 105 or 110. So, it comes down to again fives and zeros. And even, personally while we're lifting, okay, 101, new PR, great. 105 sounds a lot better though. But again, with that in mind, the strength standards, I feel like get kind of a bad rap because as a researcher, it's easy to separate people that way. Is it the best way? It may not be, but it's an easy way to do it. And, I'm definitely not the first person to do it. It's been in the literature for a really long time. But I also think from a practical standpoint, researchers need to be careful about making blanket statements in terms of saying, okay, these people squatted double body weight. These people didn't. These people were inherently better than the weaker people. Therefore, they should use this method, and other people shouldn't. That's not what the research, like the purpose of the research is. It's to identify if there's a very unique training stimulus to those individuals that have a higher baseline level of strength. Now, does that mean we're running the wrong analyses? Maybe, maybe not. But purely, it's not to take away from what people are already doing, but to say that someone can't do a lower body plyometric if they can't squat double body weight is ludicrous.
Right.
So, I gave a presentation like a little while ago in Switzerland on plyometrics, and the old standards used to be in order to do plyometrics, you need to squat double body weight, but also bench press 1.5 times your body weight. I asked everyone in the crowd how many people could do that, and I'd say out of the maybe 100 people that were there, 80 to 100 people that were there, like one person raised their hand. So I said, okay, you and I, we're gonna go do plyos. Everyone else stay here because if you do a plyo, you will explode. So we know that that's not true. There's progressions and regressions for a reason. So again, the training method, the exercises and everything are based on what the athlete needs and are capable of. Don't introduce more variation than you need to. Good training programs are generally not very sexy, but they work.
And I think that point that you just made is so essential, especially for young coaches and clinicians to take away because I made that mistake when I was a young clinician myself, right? You read all this stuff about the need for variable movement, right? To enhance movement vocabulary or movement IQ or whatever flashy term you want to throw at it. And I was literally programming specific sessions every week that were literally just designed to throw a bunch of different movement patterns at someone. And guess what? We built great movers. They moved well, but that didn't necessarily make them stronger. And again, to our point from before, everything is context dependent. So if your whole goal is we're going to get strong, then we need to train in a more boring but big, for lack of a better way to put it, fashion, right? I was able to dabble a while back into some strongman training with guys like Greg Asensio, Jeff Kriglich, Brian Alsrew, and picked up a lot from those guys. And I was fascinated by the strongman world that's literally carrying stuff, deadlifting. Like it's a lot of the same things done over and over again with
Yep.
slightly different implements.
Mhm.
But it freaking works, right?
Oh yeah.
Because to our point from before, mechanistically, it is near maximal or above a certain threshold force production, done repeatedly, done intentionally with some kind of set goal in mind. But one of the things that I think also plays a slight role into this development of strength is not just the ability of the tissues producing the movement, whether it's in lacrosse, whether it's in the weight room, wherever it is, but also the ability of the other tissues throughout the body to help withstand the force that's being produced, right? Like
Oh,
we might
yeah,
look,
absolutely.
we might
Strength.
look
Another definition of strength is just the resilience of the actual, skeletal structure, tendons, ligaments, etc. And ultimately, we going back to Wolff's law. Wolff's law essentially refers to the idea that tissues will adapt based on the stresses placed upon it. So obviously, if you take this from like an osteogenic component, heavier loads also ultimately impart larger forces on the bone, and directionally as well. So bone is going to adapt based on the stresses placed upon it. So, if we talk about the older population, for example, I'm not saying grandma and grandpa need to be like maxing out or anything like that, but they need to be able to provide an overload stimulus to allow the resiliency of the skeletal system to be, in place. But also, it's meant to be a lifelong thing. And I know Avery Fagenbaum writes about this quite a bit in terms of starting at a very young age. And it, again, not maximal, but at least doing something that's going to train those strength characteristics so that it is a lifelong thing, lifelong habit.
well, to your point about that lifelong habit and going back to your comments around plyometrics for a second, think of how many kids jump off the freaking playground,
All the
right? Like
time.
3, 4 foot drop and they take it like it's nothing.
Yeah.
But if you put them in the weight room, they're not going to bench press 1.52x body weight. They don't know what bench press is.
Yeah.
They have that plyometric component down pat, right? Like
Yeah,
it's
I talk about my niece and nephew, like, wanting to jump off things all the time, And I think about when I was a kid, jumping off things. Now, granted, at that point, you have no fear. You also don't really have real bones yet, so you can kind of do whatever you want. But no, I mean, to your point, the resiliency of the body is actually it's incredibly resilient. So the stresses that we place on it are going to be very unique to what we're doing, but also like we need to continue doing those things.
And I think another component to that as well, at least one that comes to mind for me, going back to your original definition of strength being an ability, right? Something that you can train and, enhance over time that way. And this concept of resiliency and just kind of making things more of a full body thing, for lack of a better way to put it. When I was back in my high school days, reading every article on stack.com and T Nation, hey, you got to start somewhere, right? Every article I read, I started to pick up. I was like, the bench press is not just chest, shoulders, and triceps like I thought it was, right? I thought you just laid down and pushed the bar. And then over time, I started to realize, like, oh, wow, if I grip the bar harder, it moves easier.
Mm.
Oh, hey, if I push my feet into the ground harder and I fire up everything in my legs, the bar moves easier. And it made me realize that displaying strength is not just about the strength of the primary movers, but actually the strength of the entire body, regardless of what task you're doing. I don't care if we're talking squat as like a lower body strength assessment or whatever. That way, you mentioned before the concept of the weak link principle. And ultimately, whatever that weak link is, even if it's not in your primary movers, is going to limit your ability to display strength in whatever athletic event or endeavor you're trying to pursue that way. So I think part of the development of strength is not so much, and this is like a little bit of a West Side principle, I think. It's not so much just making the primary movers that much stronger, but also finding any little weak link and attacking it to the point where it's no longer the thing holding you back in the movement.
Well, yeah, and I would agree with that. There's I do think we end up trying to be too fine and like too precise with certain
Right.
things oftentimes, because the prime movers are the prime movers for a reason.
Right.
Now uh, the co-contractors that are actually helping with those movements or the assistance muscles. It's not to say that we're not focusing on those, but to say that you know anything in sport is ultimately limited by the biceps brachii, I think is a relatively easy statement to make because there aren't too many movements that or too many sports that are ultimately going to be determined by how strong or weak someone's biceps are. Now, that being said, if that is a weak link in a movement, then it has to be trained. So, again, within the programs that I write, there's not a massive emphasis on developing the biceps. However, they are still hit in a lot of the movements that we do. Any rowing movement that we do, any pull up or chin up movement that we do, um, there's bent over row variations, even uh yeah, like I said, there's a lot of different variations that we can add in. But I often think that, these types of movements are added in just to do it. And again, someone I remember an athlete that I was helping out with a workout. They made a comment about like they had done a running workout in the morning, and then they did squats, and then they did hang cleans, and then they were doing a couple other core based exercises in terms of like multi joint movements. And then they're like, I have to go. Can you give me some core exercises like for my abs and whatnot? I said, no. And they said, "Well, why not?" And I said, "Because you did that already." And they were like, "What do you mean?" And I said, "All of these movements that you just did and the tasks that you did, you worked your core. Whether, it's not an isolated thing, but
Mhm.
I do think that we end up being too fine with our training sometimes or too precise in trying to isolate muscle groups. Now, don't get me wrong. If there are weak that and imbalances that are preventing our performance from being better, then yes, we need to incorporate those movements. But oftentimes, a lot of those muscle groups are being hit in a functional movement pattern by those large muscle group exercises. And we don't necessarily need to add in A1, A2, A3, just to have 10 exercises within a workout. Oftentimes, fewer exercises, higher quality, we're still hitting all the exact same things.
To your point about that balance on the isolation work and being maybe too precise that way. One of my favorite things when I'm doing my own training is people looking at me and trying to figure out what muscle group I'm working, right? I'm
Mm,
just working all of them, right?
yeah.
Like what does a muscle up work? It works all of it, right?
A lot of
We
things,
get
yeah.
chest, we get biceps, we get triceps, we get lats, like we just hit it all. And I think to your point, sometimes we become so lost in the grains of sand in the training world in developing strength that we forget the big rocks, right?
Mhm.
We argue over, how we can, mechanically optimally isolate, infraspinatus activation because for some reason we found out that that is the one of the three external rotators, primary external rotators of the shoulder that's holding us back, right? Or we go off these weird deep ends around like what muscle of the hip contributes to this when in reality there's so many that do that.
Oh God, yeah.
It's like, we can't just isolate it down to one thing, one. And two, I think another element of training and program design that actually inhibits the development of strength is doing too much or going too far,
Yeah.
right? Like, I love ending every workout with bicep, tricep, superset and getting a sick arm pump. But is maximally fatiguing that the best thing for developing strength if my whole goal is just get stronger? Maybe, maybe not. It depends. Ultimately, like if I want to get stronger and we're going that compound route, like going back to our bicep example, because it is summertime after all, for me, it's like weighted chin-ups, right?
Mhm.
If you can do a full range of motion, weighted chin-up, heavy load for reps, like you've checked the box. Like you don't really need to worry about all the like arm farm finishers and that sort of thing. And you can actually cut down your training time, cut down your training volume a little bit and see more of a muscular strength adaptation from just keeping strength the main thing and not getting so lost in all these other qualities that way. Not to say they're not important. And obviously, if you're an in season athlete, it's a drastically different conversation where it's like, hey, look, we might have 4 or 5 qualities to maintain and we switch to more of an undulating model. But if your whole thing is, I just want to get as strong as possible, cutting back and subtracting a little actually adds so much more, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, volume for the sake of volume is kind of pointless in my opinion. It's the workout, the adaptations that we get are going to be based on the quality of the repetitions and everything that we are performing rather than just doing more. Now, the analogy that I kind of use with this is, from like a rate of force development and power standpoint, is that the relationship between volume and those two other characteristics is like a middle school relationship. So at first, you know, we increase volume, we also increase, RFD and power because they go in the same direction. But as that relationship starts to mature, they start to go their opposite directions. I don't have any of my friends that I know that are still in the same relationship from middle school. There's probably a couple people out there, and kudos to you. But at the same exact time, they go their opposite directions. And so, again, to your point, adding exercises just for the sake of adding exercises may not actually be benefiting our force production characteristics. Now, again, we also have to take this in terms of a wave like pattern because, again, I say if we don't train it, we don't gain it. If we're not focused on maximal force production, we're probably emphasizing something else elsewhere, but that doesn't mean that we're not going to come back to it. I remember asking a football coach at one point, I said, "Do your athletes need to be powerful?" Yes. Okay. When do they need to be powerful? All the time. And I'm like, not possible. You know, they can be explosive individuals, but they're not going to be at their peak all the time. They can't be. Physiologically, it's impossible. So with that, there's an ebb and flow to the way that we train. More volume is necessary sometimes to, again, lay the foundation for what we're going to be accomplishing later. So, the general model that all of us are taught, higher volume training to develop muscle hypertrophy, work capacity, to be able to develop a foundation for strength. But you're not actually going to get strength until you actually train it, or maximal strength. But then if we're trying to refine our rapid force production characteristics, we have to decrease the volume. Volume and rate of force development, as mentioned, do not go hand in hand in a well-trained individual. So that being said, reducing the overall volume to focus on those key exercises, again, Dan, to your point, is that those exercises, it is the biggest bang for your buck exercises at that time so that we get the adaptation that we want.
Building off that concept of RFD for a second, I know a lot of people are assessing this isometrically that way, but there's been a growing interest in coaches, especially, and even clinicians in the like late stage return to sport models that way on trying to improve RFD alone. And they
Mhm.
say, hey, look, the peak of the force is high enough. They're producing enough. We're just not getting there quick enough. So it becomes how quick can we develop force that way. And I think that's an interesting concept from a training standpoint because it's like, well, we can move the weight. It's just if we look left to right side, one is just lagging behind the other. And there's a lot of different reasons for that. I think a lot of it comes back to neurological components, just anecdotally that way. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how do we go about developing literally the ability to just produce force faster. Hey, we've got a high strength peak, we're just not getting there at the rate we need applied to the context that we're trying to.
Yeah, I think, I don't like to use this term often, but you've probably heard it before, is the term power training. So, power training simply just refers to the idea that we are trying to maximize the amount of power output based on the exercise and load combinations that we have. Example, if I take a hang power clean, you're usually going to find max power output somewhere between 60 and 90% based on the individual of their 1 RM. A squat, for example, is going to be about 50 to 60%. So it's very exercise dependent. Now, I use squat and I probably shouldn't have. I would not, I would never suggest to anyone to train power output or max power output with a squat. It's not fast enough. Speed squats are still not going to give you the adaptation that I think you want. So ultimately, what this comes down to is how quickly can we produce force? So you're looking for exercises that fall under the category of rapid force production. So you're looking for lack of a better term, explosive lifts. So this can be taken. This is where the concept of like surf the curve is actually kind of come from, is where you're using a combination of heavier exercises that have lower speeds and what we would call strength speed exercises versus the opposite side that have really low loads but really high velocities, speed strength exercises. So the combination of these two things allow you to kind of surf that power curve a little bit. And again, they're probably going to be chosen based on the demands of the individual's position, sport, what have you, and where your emphasis truly lies. So if I have a football lineman, for example, they need a lot of force, but they still need to be able to generate it very quickly. But it doesn't necessarily make as much sense in that standpoint to have really lightly loaded exercises because it doesn't require them to produce as much force in a rapid manner. So moving heavy loads quickly, i.e., strength speed exercises like your weightlifting variations, your counter movement shrugs, hang cleans, power cleans, on kind of that more force dominant spectrum in terms of that rapid force production. So consider it like trying to produce force rapidly with heavy loads. On the opposite side of things, we stick with the same sport. Your skill type guys, like your corners, your defensive backs in football, they're probably going to be more apt to need to be able to produce force more rapidly um, within higher velocities. So you're looking at exercises like your jump squats, jump shrugs, hex bar jumps. It's not to say that you can't use weightlifting variations, but you're probably going to be more in the middle of that spectrum in terms of loading versus up on the like the 80-90%. They're going to be more at like the 60-70% to be able to produce that. But so it comes down to exercise choice, but it also comes down to the exercise and load combinations that you can use. The other thing that I'll say is that despite the jump shrug maybe being like the fastest weightlifting derivative that's out there, based on our research anyway, um, loaded jumps are faster. Like a hex bar jump and a jump squat, they're faster. We did a study on it. They're faster. Unloaded jumps are faster than those. Loaded sprints are faster than those. Unloaded sprints are faster than those. So the idea is that it's choosing a combination of exercise load combinations, but also methods of training that are going to allow the individual to develop the rapid force characteristics that they need within the tasks that they need to perform.
And I think you broke that down incredibly well. And to your point, understanding what exercises are faster than others and where they sit on that force velocity curve. Are they more on the strength side, more on the speed side? Are they right in the middle? And I think another element that you hit on beautifully was a lot of the examples you gave were dynamic exercise based, right? Like ultimately, if we're trying to train movement, we have to train the ability to produce force at a set rate through the entire movement pattern. Again, I mentioned before, a lot of this stuff is being assessed isometrically. And I've seen some people that are attempting to train RFD alone isometrically, and then they show progress and improvement on their dynamometer and their force plates, and they say, see, it's better. But in my opinion, and this could be a totally wrong take, but if we are literally training for the test and only the test is no longer a valid measure, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry to interrupt. I would say that isometric training certainly has its place.
It's
Um,
valuable.
yeah, it's valuable, and absolutely, especially when you're considering specific positions. You know, when we assess an isometric or within an isometric strength test, like an iso squat, for example, we can modify the position where someone's at like 120-degree knee angle versus 90 degrees. Like we can do that, and they're in those positions. And generally, if you're going to train those exercises, you usually get, like a plus or minus, 10, 15 degrees in either direction where those adaptations are beneficial. It's not to say that that's not an important component to a point to a training program, but it shouldn't be the only component to a training
Right.
program. So
100% agree.
again, if that is a weak point, train it. Absolutely. If that's a weak point, train it. But at the same time, people still have to perform dynamically. So add that as a tool in the toolbox, but don't have it be the be all end all.
Right, I 100% agree, and building off of that for another second, I think one of the things that I haven't brought up yet around this concept of strength is there has to be a standard, right? So if we take a movement, whether that's a squat or whether it's something athletically, what is your standard for it, right? Like, what does the movement look like? Obviously, they're all over the place, but are they hitting a certain depth? Are they hitting a certain range? Are they hitting a certain velocity on the VBT? Like, in general, what are you looking for? And if they're not there, and this is an area especially around the range of motion and depth component, I really like to go to the isometrics because for me, it's like, look, a lot of these younger athletes, especially, have the range to get there. They can get there, but for some reason, when we put a certain amount of load on their back or wherever, they don't move into that range. So to me, it's, hey, we can get there, but for some reason, our body is convinced we don't have the ability to produce force there. So that's an area where I really like to lean into the isometrics to help with the development of strength because we can at least teach them how to produce force and stabilize in those positions that they're not getting into otherwise. They should be able to get there. They have the ability to, but for whatever reason, they avoid it. And I think once we start to teach them, oh, this is how I produce force here, this is how I push the ground away, whatever cues you like to use that way, they actually start to move into that range dynamically, which is where we get a lot of value and benefit. And then from there, we can go into all the, super cool, flashy stuff once we've accomplished all those, foundational components, I'll say, right? Then you go to your chains, you go to your eccentric overload and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think a lot of injuries actually occur because it's not that they don't have the range of motion, but they don't have the ability to produce force within that range of motion. So I think your point is incredibly valid. I mean, you can look at it a variety of ways. I mean, I will actually start to within a season. They're still performing range of motion or full range of motion exercises, and they're maintaining that as a foundation. Now, their primary sets, however, may actually be a partial range of motion, while they still maintain the foundation of strength within the full range of motion. So, but that's also like a fatigue management strategy. It's a positional specific strategy. Sprinters, for example, it's like, do they need to be strong in their low body? 100%, absolutely, they have to. But as they progress through the acceleration, transition, max velocity phase, they are not in a full range of motion position. Now, that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be squatting there. I certainly think they need to have that foundation. But at the same exact time, you may actually start to find benefits from doing partial range of motion movements because that's where they are within that range of motion. And that's where they have to produce a lot of force. Fun fact, then you can start to add even more load in that position to produce even more force. And they can really emphasize their finish in those positions as well.
Where do you see the concept of some of these different accessories, whether that's what we talked about earlier in relation to accommodating resistance or eccentric overload, or even some of my favorite variations being like Hatfield squat and Hatfield lunge, where it's like, hey, it's not just bar in the back. Now we can actually kind of use the arms to assist and support a little bit for more of an overload effect, if you will, that way. Where do you see the time and place to go to these things, and what effectively from a programming standpoint should individuals be considering before putting those in, or even as they're thinking about how to implement them? What's kind of the method to the madness behind some of the more advanced training modalities that we've mentioned?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to monitoring the athletes long term and kind of what they need because, and unfortunately, there's no perfect formula or whatever to figure this out. But a lot of time it almost comes down to trial and error. And what I mean by that is when we're training our athletes and we continue to not see the adaptations that we want, then it's time to introduce something new. But I think the key with some of these things is that if we introduce, chains and bands or weight releasers or whatever too early in someone's development, then we can't introduce it as a novel training stimulus later. So, using the squat example, so let's say that they back squat, they back squat, they back squat, and, they've never done front squats. Well, are they capable of doing front squats? Because that's going to change the stimulus altogether. But at the same exact time, for the chains and bands standpoint, let's say that they're no longer improving the force characteristics that we want to, and they need to be faster. They need to have, more forceful during the actual movements. Well, if we add in chains or bands, now we can start to see some unique, based on the research anyway, some unique force characteristics are being produced at different times during those movements. But the key component is that it forces them to, again, solve a problem. It's a different task constraint. I remember the very first time I used chains, I was like diving into the squat rack because I was like, the weight is changing on me. Like this doesn't feel natural. But at the same exact time, once they learn the actual or like understand that this is the same movement pattern that I'm doing. It's just something's unique, something's changing during this. Once they figure that out, now they're able to more effectively produce force within that actual movement pattern. But then this is where we'd probably start to see some novel training adaptations because it is new. The other thing I will say about these advanced training methods, and you could say the same thing about the about AEL with the weight releasers and everything, but um, I think the other thing we need to be careful of is the old adage of just because you can doesn't mean you should. Um, I think what ends up happening is people fall in love with these methods, and then that's all they do. Um, Like when we use AEL with our athletes, it is not something that they are using on every single lift. They're also not using it in every single phase. Because again, there's a time and a place to elicit the adaptation that you want. Because the one thing with the weight releasers is that we know that the external load is going to be heavier on the way down. It's going to be lighter on the way up. Well, how many reps are you doing? Because if I'm doing, for example, a set of 5 or 6 and the weight releasers fall off on rep 1, is that enough? Am I getting the adaptation that I actually want? So this is why I say being able to monitor the uh, the performance characteristics, their force production characteristics in similar tasks becomes incredibly important because we need to see if they're actually adapting the way that we want them to.
I think your point on falling in love with certain training methodologies is another key take home point because that's something everyone is guilty of. Every coach, every clinician, we all kind of file into our little biases, our little favorites that way. And we think because it works for us or because it worked for this person, that it's going to work for everyone. And, that old adage, if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, holds true at the end of the day, unfortunately. I do think there's a lot of different roads that are gonna lead to Rome around the development of strength, and we can probably talk about them all day long, and we'll probably go over endless program examples and still just scratch the surface, right? Like, you could freaking carry a strongman yoke, you could squat a barbell, you could do any of these other things, you could follow a post-activation potentiation protocol, right? Like, there's so many different ways to increase your ability to produce force over a time-dependent, context-specific manner. And I think that as long as you keep in mind some of the many considerations that we discussed today, but even on top of that, like you are a phenomenal resource and have published so much research around the concept of how do we develop strength. I believe you even wrote a textbook on literally how we develop strength of the muscular system that way. So I think that, a lot of times when people need strength, I'm just going to point to the work you've already done that way, Tim. Is there anything we've missed as we were chatting today or anything else you wanted to cover that maybe we didn't get to yet?
No, I think, I mean, like you and I said, this could be like a part one, part two, part three. We could talk about this all day long and for hours and hours. And again, happy to hop on another time to continue the conversation. But yeah, I think the big take homes is that like effective training programs do not have to be sexy. Like boring training programs, as boring as they work. Like the foundational principles still apply. Being able to add in an overload stimulus with some variety and variation, with some specificity, all of those things are going to elicit the adaptations that we are looking for. But it is important to be able to monitor these characteristics long term because, again, if we're not assessing, we're guessing. We need to be able to continue to analyze like where our athletes are in terms of their abilities. With that being said, being able to develop a standard of what is good, what is average, and what is poor is really important. So once we identify those KPIs, we need to be able to benchmark them to determine are they good or not. But also note that these are going to be very individualized characteristics for what they're going to be doing. So again, trying to make things as individualized as possible is doable to an extent. I'm not going to say that it's easy, but just know that a lot of the training programs can actually be very similar. And as long as we're using the appropriate exercise and load combinations within our phases of training, I think we can get there.
Absolutely, absolutely. Tim, for people who want to find out more about you that way, where can they find you online and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I'm not on it nearly as much as I was previously, but on X and on Instagram, Dr. T Suchomel, my handle. Also on there, I think should be a link to my ResearchGate page, which has all of our research, or at least accepted versions of our research on there. And then the book is out there for people who wanna have a read of it. Science and Development of Muscular Strength, published through Human Kinetics. And I can tell you right now that there's already some things that if I were to publish edition 2 today, it'd be a lot different than edition 1. So I'm already excited about getting into that in the future. But yeah, I'd say that's pretty much it. And my email is relatively easy to find on the University of Pitt website.
That's awesome. We'll link to all of that in the description below. That way, if you didn't quite catch it, you can just click there and see everything that Tim has done research wise, authorship wise, and professor wise. Tim, you're a wealth of knowledge. I really appreciate your time and insights today, man. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.